Henry VIII's administration is categorized as a barbarous time in history area during the Bedevilled king's reign. 70,000 bodies were executed. Abounding of them were hanged, fatigued, and quartered, and huge crowds would army to attest in the executions. But on the 5th of April 1531, there was one beheading that would be austere into the memories of the assemblage at Smithfield in London until the day they died. There was a huge pot which had been brought out to the accessible beheading space, and the abode area dozens of bodies were active animate would be the abode area a man would be above alive. Richard Roose had been accursed to afterlife, and his beheading was abundantly savage, and it's acceptable that it occurred in the way it did due to Roose's doubtable crimes and additionally his job. He was a baker who was to be above animate for the actuality. He allegedly berserked the alliment of one of England's best arresting bishops. Join us today as we attending at the brutal beheading and baking animate of Richard Roose. Remember to abutment our channel. Amuse, accomplish, abiding to subscribe. During the administration of Henry VIII, there were abounding executions which were actual brutal. The king accomplished some of his abutting a company and admiral, such as Sir Thomas Added and Thomas Cromwell, and some of these are affiliated to the king's barbarous side. He alike accomplished 2 of his own wives, so was not abashed to adjustment barbarous killings to administrate justice. But it was at Smithfield which became affiliated to some of the best aboriginal executions of the time period, as abounding heretics or religious abyss were austere at the stake. It was there during the administration of Mary I, Henry's blood-soaked babe, who austere abounding bodies at the pale there. But it was additionally the armpit of and beheading of a man who wasn't accusable of treason, but he was accused of contagion some of his masters. In England, the abhorrence of contagion was arresting abnormally with the high classes, and some kings and queens alike affected agents or active specific aliment tasters to sample aliment in commons afore the king and queen would constrict into meals. This was to anticipate poisoning, and as hygiene wasn't abundant additionally during the Tudor period, generally cases of aliment contagion in commons could be affiliated to advised poisoning. So aliment alertness wasn't a faculty actual alarming job. It was central of the Abbey of Rochester, John Fisher's abode, that an accusation of contagion would booty place. On the 18th of February 1531, Fisher was in his abode accepting a meal with a cardinal of his admiral and abutting attendants. It was said in an act of assembly what occurred that afternoon. It was said, on the 18th day of February 1531, 1 Richard Roose of Rochester. Baker additionally alleged Richard Cook did casting adulteration into a vessel, abounding of agrandize or balm, continuing in the kitchen of the Abbey of Rochester's Alcazar at Lambert March, by agency of which 2 bodies who happened to eat the borscht, fabricated with such agrandize, died. So what had happened is that Richard Roose, the baker of Abbey John Fisher, was accused of contagion agrandize, and again, 2 bodies who ate the aliment fabricated by the agrandize died. The 2 bodies who died were an admirer called Bennet Kerwin, and additionally a widower who accustomed John Fisher's action of aliment central his house, and her name was Alice Trippitt. However, the added adverse aspect of an accessible contagion artifice put the absolute ambition as possibly John Fisher the bishop, as it would not accomplish any faculty for addition to aim to annihilate those 2 people. But Fisher did not eat the borscht or berserk soup, and he was complete as it's acceptable that he was abnegation during that meal. But added bodies became ill, and it was said that about 17 of Fisher's aggregation had become berserk ill, and abounding of the diners that black were those who had been accustomed into his abode for charity. With this, John Fisher's acceptability could acquire been actual damaged heavily, actuality affiliated to artifice to possibly adulteration the poor. But Fisher's brother Richard again anon went afterwards Richard Roose and approved to apprehend him and adjustment his arrest, but Roose had already able from the bishop's palace. As he ran, it's acceptable this could acquire been an indicator of guilt, but Roose was again bound bent and was again confined central the Tower of London. But the abhorrence of contagion afterwards, this adventure went into overdrive and panic throughout abounding high-chic households in London, and additionally in the aristocratic circles there was accumulation agitation and agitation over aliment actuality poisoned. This abhorrence alike accomplished the king's aristocratic court. When Roose was interrogated, it was not Bright who had accustomed Roose the adulteration to befoul the aliment of John Fisher, but additionally with this there was suspicion as to whether Roose was affiliated to a beyond artifice with some Protestants planning to annihilate or assassinate John Fisher. The abbey at the time was advised one of the greatest Catholic advisors in Europe, and he had an abundant bulk of access in England at the time. This could acquire additionally brought him into battle with the king, abnormally as he would breach from the Catholic Church and the Pope, and additionally decree himself the head of the Church of England. Henry VIII did possibly acquire a motive to backpack out the assassination of John Fisher, as he had about this time started to try and acquisition a way out of his alliance with Catherine of Aragon, and he again approved to address to the Pope to admission him a abatement so he could ally Anne Boleyn. Abbey John Fisher ultimately would after go to his own beheading for abnegation to abutment the king in his alliance to Anne Boleyn and his position as the supreme head of the church. But Henry VIII was advised one of the better problems in accepting Henry his abatement or annulment, and Fisher could acquire gone to join the king and, accurate the Pope Fisher, did this and took Catherine of Aragon's ancillary, and because of this beyond the king, but Richard, Roose the baker was central the Tower of London and was accountable to some alarming abuse central the Belled Fortress. Roose was befuddled assimilate the alarming accessory of the rack, and was accountable to a huge bulk of pain. He was put on the board frame, and his accoutrements and limbs were again put beneath absurd strain, and the arbor was a acknowledged claiming apparatus on Richard Roose. Whilst he was beneath the rack, he accepted to putting what he believed was artlessly a laxative into the yeast, and he claimed it was a assertive acidity or poison, and again he alone this as a antic into the borscht pot. Roose again gave over no names of any accessible co-conspirators, and he said that he knew that the white crumb he acclimated would annul some ill bloom or discomfort. But he claimed that he did not realize it could be fatal, and he said he alone put a laxative in the aliment and annihilation more. Added suspicion would abatement assimilate Henry VIII and the ancestors of his additional wife Anne Boleyn. As Eustace Chapais, the imperial ambassador to England for the Holy Roman Emperor, would accusation the English king, and accompaniment he was accusable of organizing the doubtable poisoning. He claimed that Anne additionally had accounting documenting about how she capital Abbey Fisher to die, and how she hated him. But because of this acknowledgment in the Tower of London, Richard Roose was never approved and was never brought in advance of a board to avert himself. On the 28th of February 1531, Henry VIII told Assembly of the contagion plot, and Roose was again accursed to die based on what the king said had happened rather than accurate evidence. The king's chat was final, and he additionally broadcast the analogue of treason, adage that annihilation by adulteration was classed as treason. He again additionally tweaked the Book of Death, adage that this abomination would again be amiss by baking alive. And this is what happened to Richard Roose. On the 5th of April 1531, in advance of a huge army in Smithfield, Richard Roose was taken to his armpit of execution. He was accountable to be above animate in a huge plot, and what the army saw that day would abode them terribly. An annual from the Tudor Ian blue-blooded the Chronicle of the Grey Friars, sawed of Roose's alarming afterlife that he was angry up in chains, and again was placed in a metal asphyxiate frame, afore he was again bargained in and out of the baking hot water. This occurred 3 times until he was again dead. Another annual of Roose's afterlife declared that he roared boss loud, and defined women who were big with adolescent did feel ailing at the afterimage of what they saw and were, agitated abroad, bisected dead. Other men and women did not assume abashed by the baking alive, but would adopt to see the headsman at his work. There were every few executions that were as barbarous as a baking alive. As the claret array screams would be heard all over Smithfield, and Roose was bargained into the baking pot of water. It's acceptable that his bark burst also, and the actuality it took aloof 3 dunks into the pot to annihilate him showed how barbarous the adjustment of beheading was. It is absorbing to exceed whether Henry VIII accurately organized Richard Roose, beheading based on the actuality he was a cook. there could acquire been some biting in this, and that his beheading could acquire been a rerun of his abomination of poisoning, as Roose was symbolically the adulteration which was bargained into the baking soup. But it's additionally absorbing to exceed whether the king was accoutrement his tracks, and whether he knew of the contagion plot. By abstinent a balloon for Roose, it was the king's chat that would book him to death, and he could acquire been accomplishing this to awning his tracks. However, the barbarous king, Henry VIII, would after book Abbey John Fisher to death, and he and Anne Boleyn would get what they wanted. Fisher was accomplished for abnegation to acquire Henry as the head of the church and favoring the Pope in this role. Fisher met his afterlife with dignity, clashing his baker who was above animate in alarming fashion. Thanks for watching. To abutment our approach, amuse, accomplish, abiding. To subscribe. Thanks for watching.